like to welcome all of you. I'm Elliot Gerson with the Aspen Institute. I'd first like to thank Alma and Joe Gildenhorn, who are the ones responsible for this terrific series of conversations with authors. And we're especially happy when they're here today. And I have to say, I had no idea when I think we had dinner, it was about a year ago, and Sid mentioned that he was working on a book. I had no idea whatsoever what an incredible book it would be and what a splash it would cause. However, when I did get the galleys a few months later, I knew that this was going to be an extraordinary book, received incredibly well. But even then, I couldn't have predicted the kind of response it's gotten in the last couple of weeks with extraordinary reviews really around the world. And Sid is now spending a great bit of his time just going around and talking about it. You may have heard him on National Public Radio the other morning. He was just at the museum being interviewed. And I just can't, frankly, remember a work of nonfiction about a scientific topic that has gotten this kind of response, and I'm sure will continue to get this kind of response. I think if you do get the book, you're not going to be able to put it down. It's really a tour de force with brilliant insights that aren't just about the scientific quest of our age, which is treatments for cancer, but about literature, about history, about culture. So it's really a remarkable book. And so even I might also add, if the last book you read about science, particularly one with this many pages and this heavy, was that dreaded high school chemistry text, forget that and please pick this up and read it. Maybe just to start, Sid, and we will have a conversation as usual and then open it up to questions. Given this whirlwind that you're on, who's looking after your patients?
Well, thankfully these days first of all, thank you for having me here. It's been a real pleasure. Elliot was one of the few people who saw the book at a time when the book was not even in galley stage, but it was a sheaf of manuscript, as it were. And as you know, writing a book, the book becomes your baby, and to see the embryonic stage of that, for me, it was a wonderful experience talking to Elliot right through this. So thank you. Who's taking care of my patients? Well, thankfully these days in medicine we work in teams such that responsibilities are more divided. But you know what's funny about it is that medicine, in a certain sense, the more evocative, the more shamanic aspects of medicine can't be done in the team. You always have one doctor, and that doctor, he or she, becomes your doctor for life, and that's the most moving and most profound things about medicine. So even as I do this, I actually check in usually every morning. I have a staff, I check in every morning, and whenever I need to be on the phone, I'm on the phone. Now that said, I'll tell you a little aside in all of this, which is that my book tour continues, but then I'm on call through Thanksgiving. So I land on a plane from Toronto, I drive to the hospital actually, and start rounding on patients, and the good news about that is that it keeps you humble, and it keeps your eyes on the real situation, which is the job is to take care of patients.
Well, just on that note, Sid, what, as someone who is a devoted clinician and a researcher, what inspired you to write a book like this?
One of the reasons was I was responding to a peculiar vacuum that existed around the subject. I mean, cancer is a disease that in epidemiological, biological, political ways, cultural ways, has invaded our public consciousness so deeply that you cannot open a newspaper without encountering the word. You cannot walk or talk in a social context without encountering someone whose life has been directly affected by cancer. And yet, what was amazing to me while I was training as a fellow was that there was no book really about its history. I mean, that vacuum was astonishing to me. There have been attempts to write histories of little pieces of this. Richard Rettig's book about the politics of the war on cancer is an interesting precursor to this. There have been attempts to write around the idea of cancer, particularly in the 1970s. But there was an enormous vacuum. When Hillary climbed Everest, he was asked why he climbed Everest, and he said, "I climbed it because it was there." And I felt as if, this book is by no means, am I trying to say it's grandiose enough like climbing Everest, but I wrote this book because it was not there, because in a certain fundamental sense, it didn't exist. And the book really grew out of a question that a patient had asked me, but variations of this question have appeared through the lives of every single person who's in cancer medicine. And the question was, this woman I was treating for abdominal cancer said, I'm willing to go on with treatment, but I need to know what it is that I'm battling. It was a very humbling question, because not only could I not tell her in the fullest sense of the word, but I also couldn't point to a book that would inform her about what it was she was battling. And this is the most legitimate of questions that a patient could ask you. What is its history? What is the origin? Where are we going? What happens next? And so the book is in some ways a 600-page answer to that question, and it couldn't be a shorter answer, because this is the length of the history itself.
And then you call it a biography, and which is an unusual choice, and obviously suggests that you see something very human about this thing that you're writing about, and that continues to be a metaphor throughout the book, about its mind, about its psyche, perhaps a deranged psyche nonetheless. But why biography?
So, I didn't arrive at that word until quite late into writing the book. I did have a feeling while I was writing that the word history was too inert. It didn't suggest the depth, the visceral nature, and certainly didn't encapsulate the fact that this is also threaded through this book, importantly, are the stories of my patients, particularly Carla and others. So I was looking for something that would capture that idea more richly. And again, as I said to you, the word history seemed just too inert to capture that idea. Cancer is not a single disease. As we know, it is a multitude of diseases, but there are deep enough biological, political, and cultural themes that cut through this biology, or cut through this disease, that really begins to justify or legitimize the process of writing about it as if it was not something, but someone. And that human quality, I wanted to suggest that human quality. So it was somewhere in the middle of the book, I sort of said, well, the word history is just not right, and maybe the word biography captures that idea more metaphorically, and hence the word biography.
And the book, and we'll come back to this, is a collection of extraordinary biographies, not just Carla, your patient, but of famous figures in the fight against cancer.
Absolutely.
And we'll talk about that. But let's just stick with history before we move up to the contemporary. What are the first references to what we now know is cancer?
Well, the very first references are a little bit hard to tease apart, because the word even doesn't exist. The word will come to will arrive at the moment that the word sort of hits the medical and cultural vocabulary of our human history. But we think that these are cancers because their descriptions remind us of something that can only be similar to cancer. The very first time, actually, interestingly, there's this idea that's been floating around that cancer is a disease of modernity, that there's something modern about cancer. But in fact, interestingly, the very first time the word a disease like cancer is described comes to us from the very oldest textbook of medicine that human beings have ever seen, and that's the Edwin Smith Papyrus. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, written sometime around 2500 BC and then retranscribed sometime around 1500 to 1600 BC. So this is about 4,000 odd years ago, describes a case in which the scribe talks about a disease in the breast which resembles breast cancer. His words are very beautiful. He says, well, here it is. He describes it. He says it's cold and dense, much like a kind of fruit that he was familiar with. And he says, but remember, but it's not warm, and therefore it's not inflammatory. It's not an inflammation. It's not an infection. It does not break water or bleed water. And again, this idea of that it's discriminated from an infection was very important. So that's the very first time we hear about it. And
did it say anything about whether it could be treated?
And that's what's really chilling. So in the papyrus, Imhotep, who's the Egyptian scribe, usually writes a little remedy for every disease. And for cancer, he has a lovely line. He says, there is no treatment. And it's that moment of silence that strikes you as, it really chills your bones. I was talking to an oncologist about this, and he said to me that if you look at Imhotep's book, and it's written in 2500 BC, and the description and the humility doesn't raise goosebumps, then you're in the wrong profession. You should not be doing oncology if you can't go back to that book and say, here's a disease that was written about 2,500 years ago, and here I am in 2010 with struggling for some kinds of cancer, struggling like that, and essentially saying to myself, there's no cure.
And then I was struck by another snippet of history in the very early history, when you talk about the Persian queen, and was reminded of the image of Helen of Troy and the face that launched 1,000 ships. Tell us how this Persian queen and her apparent cancer had similarly perhaps profound effects on history.
Well, so again, we're not 100% sure that Queen Atossa of Persia did have cancer, but she has a disease which is described so vividly, again reminiscent of cancer. So Queen Atossa was the wife of Darius, a very powerful queen, a very powerful wife of a very powerful king, the king of Persia, which, as you might remember, was actually the epicenter of civilization at that moment. And Herodotus records her story. She is diagnosed with a disease. We only know it from the Greek as a mass. Interestingly, she had the opportunity to avail of every physician in Babylon, but she doesn't. She covers herself in shame, and she refuses to talk about it. And ultimately, she is treated and possibly cured by a Greek slave whose name is Democedes. And we don't know exactly what happened, but given if it was cancer, it was probably a kind of a primitive version of a mastectomy or a lumpectomy that was performed. We know little exactly about it. And then, as Herodotus tells us, Democedes, who was from Greece and captured into Persia, begs the queen as a reward for his curing her. He begs the queen to ask to bring him back to Greece. And the way the queen does this is by asking Darius, her husband, to not invade Scythia, which is on the eastern border, but to invade Greece instead, so that Democedes, the slave, can be brought back to his native Greece. And in fact, this is what happens. This is how Herodotus records the story. And he says that essentially that movement from the eastern face of Persia to the western face of Persia, which is Greek, launches the Greco-Persian War. And the Greco-Persian War, of course, is one of the most seminal moments in the history of the West. And so there's a point that's made that it's actually Atossa's cancer that launches 1,000 ships, but in this clandestine way. She cannot speak about it. And so cancer, even in this kind of primitive manner, leaves its fingerprint on the ancient world. Very, very moving story. So,
well, I mean, actually, even until 1950, the New York Times wouldn't even print the word cancer.
Yeah.
So this stigma continued for millennia.
Isn't that an amazing story? So Fanny Rosenau's, I tell Fanny Rosenau's story from an interview in this book, and Fanny Rosenau, some people here might know, was an important advocate for breast cancer, and she was a survivor, and it's a tragic story. She calls up the New York Times in 1950, and she wants to place an advertisement in the Times saying, I'd like to start an advocacy group, a survivors group for women with breast cancer. And then she's put on hold. And then about several minutes later, she's puzzled. Several minutes later, the society editor of the Times gets on the phone and says, well, Ms. Rosenau, we can't print the words breast and cancer in the New York Times. Would you mind if we said a support group for women with chest diseases? This is... I made it a point, actually, of this is not so long ago. I made it a point when the New York Times came to see me in the laboratory and to review this book. I made it a point to say this to Charles McGrath. And I said, actually print that story as a reminder to yourself and to me to remind us what this history is.
One other aspect of history before we come closer to the present, and that, of course, is other than those kinds of instances where you imagine that based on the circumstances it must have been cancer, there really are few references historically to cancer, in part because we didn't live as long. I mean,
that's right. I mean, absolutely, cancer is an age-related disease. It's important to realize that cancer is an age-related disease, but it's not only an age-related disease. We have everyone, I'm sure, knows of a 36-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old diagnosed with cancer. So let it be clearly said that although it's an age-related disease, it is not only an age-related disease. But the longevity, the expanse of human longevity has absolutely increased the prevalence and the incidence of cancer in the world, particularly some kinds of cancer. I'm going to take a little aside here and say that that was actually an interesting challenge in writing the book. And that challenge was, how does one make this a human story when the human beings have disappeared, when these patients have disappeared? And someone asked me, well, how did you write this book? And I said, well, you know, the boon and the bane of writing this book was that I wrote it very linearly. So I started on page 1 and ended on page, I'm not going to dissuade anyone, on page 6, page 50. No, on page 500 and whatever it is. But because I wrote linearly, and because I had a very acute sense that I needed to have the patients in the book, when I would get stuck, I would say, well, where's the story? Who is the first child who was treated for leukemia? And because I was so stuck, I would say, well, unless I found the story of that child, this book couldn't be written. And it became, for me, a kind of an internal propulsion engine. I said, well, you know, this is the reason I have to discover the story. May I take an aside to tell the story of this child? Because for me, it was very metaphorically rich. The book is dedicated, by the way, if you open the book, to Robert Sandler, 1945 to 1948, and to those who came before and after him. And we don't know until we reach the middle of the book who Robert Sandler is, but I will tell you. I don't think I'd break a minute of suspense by this, but I became obsessed with finding the first child who was treated with chemotherapy in Boston. I didn't know his name. From Sidney Farber's papers, I knew his initials. I knew it was RS, and I knew he had a twin whose name was ES. And I knew the boy had lived for about 3 months after he came to Sidney Farber's clinic, had a remission, and then died. And of course, that remission becomes an incandescent moment for cancer research, because it's the first time that an aggressive cancer has been sent into a remission by a medicine alone, not surgery, not radiation, but through a medicine. And it really propels the war on cancer. So Robert Sandler is in some ways the beginning of this incredible movement. You know, every time the breast cancer patients march on the river, they're in some sense replying back to a legacy that involves, at least to some extent, Atossa, but also Robert Sandler. But of course, I didn't know his name. And so I was there sitting in Boston, sending out emails and messages saying, well, I'm in Boston. He lived in Boston somewhere in this world. He has a twin. You know, so I would send a message saying, if you happen to have a twin who was treated for leukemia in Boston, then please contact me. You know, I'm writing this book. And there was no reply, nothing, just blank. And so I was disheartened, and I went to India, to my parents' house, and someone said to me, well, there's a historian who lives a few blocks down and who had been interested a long time ago in the history of chemistry and had some brief intersection with Sidney Farber. Would you like to go and see him? So I said, of course, I'll go see him. So I drive over 3 blocks from my parents' house, 1,000 miles away from Boston. I walk into this man's house, and he starts talking about his experiences. And he says, oh, you know, I had been to Sidney Farber's hospital in 1958, and if you're interested, I have a roster of all these leukemic patients that he was treating. And in that roster is a picture, and it's a picture of Robert Sandler, RS. And so I ran back, when I flew back, but I ran back to Boston, and then using the Boston Public Library records, I could find the death records for RS. And then by cross-referencing those records, I could find the mother, the name of the mother, and ultimately a photograph of the child. And then 15 or 20 minutes later, I was in Dorchester standing in the home of Robert Sandler. Now, this story carries a lot of meaning for me personally, because number one, it's a metaphor for me, because it's a metaphor for why this book could be written. It could be only written through a process of serendipity and discovery, and a kind of human process, trying to understand my own history, which would not be possible if I hadn't found Robert Sandler, who came from 1,000 miles away from where I was looking. So it's a long aside, but I think an important aside. And every single minute in the book, whenever I felt the pulse of this book drop, unlike writing an inert history, I said to myself, go find the patient, and the book will solve itself.
And it's a wonderful thing to experience. As you would imagine, a book on a topic like this, it's full of epiphanies and frustrations and dead ends, but also the tears and the joy.
Yes.
But those human stories, whether it's RS or whether it's Carla, but then there are also the stories of the pivotal figures in medical history. And they all tell their own stories. You mentioned Sidney Farber, and I'd like to come back to that. But there's also the story about William Stewart Halstead.
Yes.
And the most significant, really the only treatment of cancer for its first 100 years, from 1850 to 1950, was surgery.
Yes.
And then just north of us in Baltimore, Halstead is named on his name's on buildings and hospitals. But tell us the story of what that meant, and that kind of aggressive treatment, and what the lessons were from that.
Well, Halstead is a complicated character. Many people, I'll tell you why, but Halstead is a complicated character. Many people read this book and say Halstead is the villain of the book. And I say that's absolutely not true for me. Actually, there's a passage in the book which was taken out early on, in which I talk about how, as an oncologist, and perhaps even as a cancer patient, you develop a kind of peculiar sympathy for Halstead. Because here he was trying his best to do what he could do his best at, and that was surgery. But let me tell you the story. Halstead is an incredible character. My train this morning, which was stuck for an hour, took me through Baltimore and actually gave me a sense again, made me think once again of Halstead. Halstead was a brilliant surgeon, probably one of the most brilliant surgeons in the history of surgery. And he became compulsively interested in breast cancer. And he had picked up this idea. He'd gone to Europe at a time when surgery had undergone an immense improvement in Europe. In fact, these surgical improvements we talk about had changed the entire face of cancer medicine for the first time. And surgery, of course, still remains a very central player in cancer, in the treatment of cancer patients. But Halstead had gone to Europe, and he had come upon this frustration, which is that women with breast cancer would be treated with surgery, but then the cancer would relapse again, often locally. So you'd have a mass, a lump, it would be taken out, and then 6 or 7 months later there would be cancer around that same site. And Halstead became a kind of victim or an emblem of a theory that runs deeply through the book, which is actually a theory that's not about cancer alone, but has something to do with the human psyche, which is if something is good, then more of that something must be better, particularly in cancer. So Halstead comes back from Europe, but he comes back from Europe, by the way, with an interesting problem, and that is that he has discovered, he's very interested in anesthesia, and of course the most prominent anesthesia at that time is cocaine. And so he begins to inject himself with cocaine because he wants to try to find the right doses for his patients. And of course, within a few weeks, he's an addict. And he tries to detox himself by using morphine. And then he becomes addicted to morphine. And so here he is, swiveling between these two addictions, cocaine and morphine. And he checks himself into sanity. You know, the incredible discipline of him is part of this book. The discipline of him saying to himself, well, I'm now clearly an addict, cocaine and morphine, but I will manage by controlling the dose so precisely that I will smooth out the addiction through the whole day so that I can perform surgery. So here is Halstead, addicted, injecting himself, coming back to the operating room. And while he's doing this, he's inventing the most radical attack on breast cancer. He's gone back to Europe and he said to himself, well, if the reason for relapse is local recurrence, then the answer must be we need to excavate more, we need to cut out more. And by cutting more, that must mean curing more. And so he sort of lunges himself step by step towards more and more aggressive radical dissections, such that now he is not only taking out the breast, but muscles underneath the chest. and the collarbone in some cases, Halstead, not Halstead, but his students, rib cage, pieces of the rib bone. Now, but that said, he becomes so compulsively attached to this. And then there's a moment in that history which is particularly poignant. He invents a word for this. He calls it radical surgery. Now, Halstead means that word to mean radical from the same root that the word radish arises from, meaning root. He's trying to attack the roots of cancer. But there's a pun in that word. Halstead has a very beautiful ear for words. There's a pun in the word, and radical, of course, also means aggressive. And radical surgery essentially then burrows itself as a root, as it were, into the psyche of surgery. What patient, what woman now offered the option of radical versus non-radical surgery for cancer was going to take non-radical surgery as her option, right? So it becomes, the word itself becomes a metaphor. The word becomes the war. And it takes, this is the astonishing thing, Elliot, it takes 90 years. It takes 90 years and an enormous resistance among surgeons before you finally undo that theory.
And then it's done from Europe. Like Jeffrey Keynes?
To start at Europe, Jeffrey Keynes, the more famous brother, or the less famous brother of John Maynard Keynes, was a surgeon, was a wartime surgeon. And and as I said, one of the things that I wanted to do in the book is that I had to, in order to write the book because I was stuck, I had to go to London to look through Jeffrey Keynes' notebooks. And there, buried in his notebooks in 1930-something, is a little line from Jeffrey Keynes which says, I'm not sure, I'm paraphrasing the book, I will tell you the exact line, it says, I'm not sure that for this particular woman who he's treating, the radical approach is correct. Perhaps she should have been treated with a local mastectomy or lumpectomy. So what he's doing is in this tiny chamber in London, he has pricked radical surgery with a lancet. And it will take another 50 years before a clinical trial can be launched that ultimately tells us that
And what does it say about the culture of medicine that it took that long for that recognition?
It says something about the culture of medicine. Unfortunately, the culture of medicine repeats itself, much like history. It repeats itself just as acutely in a matter of another 5 or 10 years, because radical surgery then becomes radical chemotherapy, right? So it says something about the history of medicine that I don't think medicine often wants to hear. And again, it says the old dictum, if something is good, then more of that something must be better. And that's not right often.
Let's move back to Sidney Farber and the work he does in a basement in Boston, and then how that leads through the remarkable remissions in childhood leukemia to Mary Lasker and the war on cancer, and what that and how that unfolded.
Sure. For a book like this, obviously you need a central anchor. And very early on in the book, I chose Sidney Farber for a certain set of reasons. I mean, this is a story that's so large, it could be told through the eyes of 1,000 different ways. It could be told through the eyes of Halstead, actually. I happened to choose Sidney Farber for a very particular reason, and it's a metaphorical reason. And the reason is that Farber, of course, makes a very seminal contribution to the history of cancer in the invention of the very first chemotherapy. He's actually second, but he becomes first because the other form of chemotherapy arises from a war gas and has to be secret. It's a secret until the war blows over, essentially. But Farber invents chemotherapy, and he therefore begins to imagine the idea of attacking cancer using chemicals. But here's what happens to Farber. Having done this, having emerged out of his basement to now start treating children, Farber undergoes a second transformation. And the second transformation is a transformation from a scientist into a political activist, into a political voice. He essentially collaborates with Mary Lasker to become, to launch the war on cancer, and he provides scientific legitimacy to this war, in a sense that Mary Lasker herself couldn't. She was not a scientist, although very much a friend of the sciences. And so essentially it's this double transformation of Farber, the fact that Farber comes out of his basement and enters the political world, which mirrors, of course, the emergence of cancer itself from a whispered about disease into a political phenomenon. So I saw this parallel occurring between Farber's own life and between the emergence of cancer as a phenomenon in public life, and therefore Farber was chosen. So going back to Sidney Farber through a series of amazing accidents, leaning actually back to a work of a woman called Lucy Wills, an English woman, eccentric English woman. There's a lovely story about Lucy Wills, which is not in this book. She was a fanatic about bike riding. She lived at Oxford, and she loved riding her bicycle. And for the longest time, she refused all forms of transport. And when she was about 30-something, she had already discovered this idea that she had discovered the notion that chemicals could turn on and turn off blood. And that idea would eventually give birth to Farber's chemotherapy. But returning back to Lucy Wills, she would move through Oxford, and she didn't have a bell, and she would often scream at people. She would say, "Move out of my way, move out of my way," instead of ringing her bell. It was again an example of the way she was so in the 1920s, so driven that she had found very unusual for a woman of her in that time to have found that. To have made that discovery and publicized it, but that's Lucy Wills. Coming back to Farber. Farber then invents this form of chemotherapy, has these brief remissions, 5, 6, 12-month remissions, but then uses that idea to say, well, there must be chemicals that can attack cancer, and if there's one such chemical, if there's one such strategy, there must be a host of such strategies. And he launches that's his first experiment. His second experiment is actually an experiment in media. It's an experiment not in the scientific laboratory, but sort of an experiment in public service, or an experiment in the human world. And he says to himself, well, in order to fund this effort, we need to create a mascot. We need a symbol. We need a human being that this massive effort can be hung upon. And he, in the moment of genius, he finds, he collaborates with the Variety Club in Boston, and he's told to find this mascot, this one child, and he can't find them because his children upstairs are miserable. They're all, they have leukemia, they're throwing up, these chemotherapies are making them sick. There's one child who looks healthy enough, and he doesn't have leukemia, and unfortunately, his name is Einar Gustafsson. This is Boston in 1950s, and he says to himself, my God, Einar Gustafsson will never sell a War on Cancer. This child is from northern Maine. He's of Swedish descent. Picturesque, there's a picture of him in the book. But his name is Einar Gustafsson, so Farber says, we're going to call you Jimmy. And so whether Einar Gustafsson agreed or not, he became Jimmy. And of course, this is the birth of the Jimmy Fund. The Jimmy Fund is what I call Farber's second experiment. Farber's second experiment is an experiment in finding out how you can create a mascot for the war, and Jimmy becomes the mascot for the war. And then, having made Jimmy, Farber then launches his third and the biggest experiment of all, and that is when he liaises with Mary Lasker to persuade Nixon to launch the war on cancer.
And this is the time of the moon. Exactly.
So remember, we put ourselves back in that moment. This is a time that, of course, we're coming off the Second World War. This is post-war America in its sort of cultural zenith. Men have landed on the moon. The idea that you can have what was called a moonshot for cancer, that you would conquer cancer shortly if you poured in enough resources, was very much part of this culture. And Mary Lasker enters this world. She had already entered this, but Mary Lasker entered this world like a typhoon. Mary Lasker is a name writ large across the history of American science. She was an entrepreneur. She was a force of nature. People remember Mary Lasker as being someone who could annihilate resistance. She would walk into a room and the word no didn't exist in her vocabulary. It was not part of the day-to-day dealings with life. There's a lovely picture of her, I think, in this book, sitting in her apartment. Her apartment was all white. She loved the color white, and every piece of it was curated, even the flowers. And there's another picture of her standing in front of this beautiful Monet, and for the longest time, I thought to myself it was taken outside the Museum of Modern Art. And then someone said, actually, no, the Monet belongs to Mary Lasker. So just to remind us, incredibly wealthy, but someone who really dedicated her life and her wealth, in fact, to cancer. And so she finds in Farber her ally, and she begins to use unbelievable resources, resources that are both financial, but also cultural. The idea that you can tap into public consciousness and activate certain buttons. This kind of technology that Mary Lasker invented, which is, go and talk to the editor of Reader's Digest and place this article there tomorrow, was very unique, actually. We take it a little bit for granted now, but the idea that she would call up an editor and say, well, what if next week you ran an article on breast cancer? And famously, she went to Ann Landers and said, well, what if you place this advertisement in the newspaper saying, vote yes for the war on cancer and so forth. So Mary Lasker and Sidney Farber really launched the war, and its culmination, and again there's a reproduction here, is this advertisement from 1969, which is really kind of a marker in which begins with, Mr. Nixon, you can cure cancer. Some people might remember this from the papers. It ran in multiple papers. And there's a line in there which is very evocative. It says, why don't we cure cancer for America's 200th birthday? What a gift that would be. So that birthday has passed. But
and let's talk about that sort of the what you call in the book the culture of cure in the United States. Yes. And this appeal for whether it's the radical surgery or the magic bullet or the targeted chemical, and what has the result been of that kind of culture focused so much on cure?
Right. Well, I think for me, one of the most interesting discovery aspects of the book was exactly that culture of cure. And as you know, cancer is not the only place where that culture of cure has left a deep impact. I mean, even when I read the newspapers today about foreign policy, for instance, it makes me wonder how much we can still learn from medicine, how much medicine can learn from reading the newspaper. This idea that there are curative solutions to things that are very difficult and complex is, of course, writ large through our culture. On one hand, it can break through nihilism, and in the case of cancer, that nihilism was very important to break through that nihilism, because people say, well, you never cure this disease, it's too complicated. But on the other hand, of course, that culture of cure very quickly tips into hubris, and that tension between optimism and hubris is very much part of the book. It's very much part of our world today. No sooner has a new drug being released from the farm, into the pharmacy, that we're talking about cure again. So this is with us. This is going to stay with us for a long time, particularly the metaphorical, cultural aspects, and I actually explore them very.
And in that context, one of the implications of that culture, you suggest, is lack of focus on prevention.
Yes.
Or a notion somehow that prevention is almost un-American.
Yes.
That we'll cure it. We don't have to prevent
that's right.
it.
And in fact, there's a line in the book in which I think the Chicago Times actually says this. It says, it's quite clear to us that there's a sentiment that's going around in sciences that prevention is un-American. So let's talk a little bit about prevention. In the 1960s and 1970s, when these chemotherapies were arising, there was certainly a dip in prevention research, and because, again, people were so convinced that, much like smallpox, this disease, or polio, again, there's a long section on polio in this book, because polio is the direct antecedent or the precedent to cancer. And the fact that polio became preventable through vaccination writ itself large through the history of cancer. If we could pour in resources, in fact, what's interesting is that the polio virus was not deeply understood when the polio vaccine was developed. It's a forgotten part of our history. David Drushinsky, who wrote this wonderful book on polio, which you may have read, called Polio: An American Story, writes about this idea that the vaccine was developed through a series of circumstances which had some knowledge about what happened to the polio, what the polio virus was, but not the deepest knowledge. And that notion that you could somehow cut quickly to the chase, as it were, without understanding the deep biology of the cancer cell, was very much part of the 1960s. And it took a very stringent statistical analysis that was performed in 1987 for the first time. It was updated again and again, 1987, 1997, and most recently in 2007, to remind us that the war on cancer using curative treatments was not really going as well as we had thought it was going. And that analysis comes to us from John Baylor. Has been done elsewhere. I call John Baylor the nation's reminder-in-chief of cancer. He comes every 10 or odd years, and he comes and reminds us. He's like the bean counter. He tells us, well, wait a second, just before you get too happy, here's what the real numbers are. And he performs this analysis for the first time in 1987, and he plots cancer-specific mortality. We can talk about why that's interesting and complicated. He plots cancer-specific mortality over time, and in fact shows that, if anything, cancer-specific mortality has gone up since the war was declared. Yeah, since the war was declared. That was a very chilling moment for cancer researchers. And one of the points that Baylor makes in his 1987 article is that we are not spending enough time or money on prevention. So by that time, to some extent, that had already been rectified. So the National Cancer Institute budget had been moved a little bit more towards prevention. So by the time Baylor had written this article, it had already become part of the consciousness of the National Cancer Institute. Two pieces of important information. Number one is that Baylor has repeated this analysis in 1997 and 2007, most recently. And it turns out that the picture has become much, much more positive. So having risen until 1987, Baylor probably caught the war on cancer at its worst moment, when the effects of smoking, particularly among women from the 1950s, was being played out in the killing fields of cancer 20 years later in the 1970s, 1980s, and so forth. But since 1997, for nearly about 15 to 20 years, there has been a decline in cancer-specific mortality in the United States. And that is an enormous victory. That curve, the capacity to take a curve that is rising inexorably, bend it at a plateau, and move it downwards, it's hard for me to really fathom what an enormous victory it is. It is taking the natural course of what would become or was becoming an epidemic, turning it around, and twisting it downwards again. And some people might say, well, we're still not winning the war on cancer, but the capacity to do that in human history is unprecedented. And I think that's part of the victory of prevention, therapy, education, cultural shifts, etc. There's been no single victory.
Let's talk about victory in the following context. As a biographer, most biographers, when they write a book, confront at some point the death of the person about whom they're writing. And is it in any conceivable sense possible to contemplate the death of cancer?
So it's an important question. We try to tackle that question at the end of the book. One thing about writing the book, I have to say, which made it particularly poignant, is that while writing this book, I didn't know whether Carla would live or die at the end of the book.
So, tell us about Carla.
So again, one of the stories that threads the whole book together and gives the book a human face is the story of one of my patients who goes through chemotherapy for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the very tumor that launches this revolution, the tumor that Farber first attacks, and eventually colleagues of Farber's or friends of Farber's and his students eventually cure. And that cure in the 1970s really launches this idea that cancer could potentially be a curable disease, and thereby launches the war on cancer. Carla, my patient, has this form of leukemia, but in adults, the cure rate sinks down to about 30%, for reasons we don't know, 30 to 40%. And so Carla becomes, of course, the beacon for this book, but it's a beacon that is always moving to some extent. I sort of wrote this book, and people say, well, how did you write this book? It was like driving without a destination, because in the end of the book, there was a 70% chance, statistically speaking, that the book would end with her demise. And and that would change the tone of the book, and I didn't know what tone it would take. I mean, how does one write a book without an ending? But she's alive, 5 or 6 years since the book, since she had her disease. I hope she's been cured. That brings us, of course, to the idea of the death of cancer. Again, the end of biography. The story in this book is that one thing that we've realized, and it's not just a biological realization, but a cultural and a political and a philosophical realization about ourselves, is that cancer is stitched into our genome. By that I mean that the very genes that in their corrupted form cause cancer are vital to the growth of cells. Cells contain genes that allow them to grow, allow them to adapt, to survive, to resist poisons. This is why we can become multicellular human beings. But if you take those very same genes that allow embryos to develop, that allow our hands to become hands, and if you distort them, those become cancer genes. Now that moment, again, when the first time that was realized in 1976 by Harold Varmus, among other people, that sent such a chill through the world of cancer medicine and cancer biology. It's hard to describe that, because here we were hoping that this gene would come from outside. This would be some exogenous event. And of course, carcinogens activate these genes, and thereby there is an element in which cancer comes from outside. But the fundamental lesion in many cancers, not all, but in many cancers, is a genetic lesion, is a genetic change, a mutation in a gene that sits in each and every one of our chromosomes. It is as much a part of being a human being as anything else. This is the very genetic makeup, and therefore the idea that we will eliminate or eradicate cancer from our world is by necessity a false idea. This is not a disease that will be eliminated from our lives and our species. So what do? Well, while writing this book, I went to see Richard Peto, one of the people who discovered the link between lung cancer and smoking. And as I was leaving his office, there's a little slogan in his office which says, death at old age is inevitable, but death before old age is the frontier of medicine. And so that's a pretty significant thing. That's a pretty significant goal. So if we could push the frontier of cancer as far as we can in human longevity, I think that will mark a kind of victory, not the death of cancer, but a kind of victory that will change, I think, the history of, even with all due humility, will really change the history of our species.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's open to your questions, please. And if you could take the microphone, I think that one's right in front of you. Give us your name and...
My name is Paula Gordon, and I have a website called GordonCancerTheory.com, which originated out of work I did in the 70s. I had been able to meet and interview many key people at that point in time, Joseph Easels and Chisato Maruyama and John Holt, among others. And one of the things that influenced my development of a theory of carcinogenesis and anti-carcinogenesis was the NIH symposium that was held on the spontaneous remission or regression of cancer in the 70s. And I think this is still available through Medlars at NIH. And what they did there, and I hope they'll repeat, or someone will repeat this kind of symposium, is to bring together all the anecdotal evidence about the spontaneous regression of cancer. If you look at things like septicemia and malaria and cobra bites, a whole host of different things had led to. The bottom line is, the thing that they all have in common is that the immune system is hyped. And I wonder to what extent you might have been looking at that.
Well, this area, thank you, it's a very interesting question. This area was dead, was a scorched minefield for literally tens of years. It had vanished almost from the consciousness of. There were these sort of feeble attempts to activate the immune system to attack cancer, but this was a desert. And then, all of a sudden, this has started to change, and I'll tell you a couple of things that have started to change about it. Most recently, the idea that the immune system has an interaction with cancer had been known way back, and spontaneous remissions were part of that theory. But again, no one had really been able to activate the immune system very well. These were anecdotal cases. No one knew what was up with them. But then most recently, Jim Allison, and among others, has found mechanisms that you can activate the immune system. And if you activate the immune system, much like the cancer cell also has accelerators and brakes, such that we are not explosive, we're not exploding with immunological reactions. I mean, if our immune system went berserk, it is so powerful, people call it a sleeping giant, it's so powerful that it can eat up our bodies within a matter of a few days. We've seen that happen in patients when it gets inappropriately activated. Now, Jim Allison found a way of more subtly activating the immune system, and this drug, which is a blockade of a particular molecule called CTLA-4, was tested in malignant melanoma, metastatic melanoma. That's the one disease in which the immune system in which spontaneous remissions have occurred quite importantly. And I was just reminded this, the trial was very positive. This was a randomized phase 3 trial of activation of the immune system against malignant metastatic melanoma. It was very positive. But strikingly, as Jim Allison reminded me a few weeks ago, he said that there has been no drug in the history of malignant metastatic melanoma that's showed a positive result in survival. It's the only drug. So it reminds us that this is an evolving frontier. We know very little about it, but it's clearly an evolving frontier for cancer medicine. It would probably rank for treatment, it would probably rank among the top 10 directions that most cancer biologists are looking today.
Another question.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Let me just move this up here.
Hi, I'm Leah Gold. I'm representing Baltimore. I wanted to find out, other than not smoking and eating highly toxic things or exposing ourselves to radiation in the sun, etc., what do you do to prevent yourself from getting cancer? And do you feel that any type of vitamins or supplements can help boost our immune systems? Is there anything that we can do to prevent cancer?
You know, I follow the NCI guidelines. I follow the guidelines that have been laid down because I don't think that I have not seen convincing evidence in anything that I've read so far that talks about a rigorous enough preventive regimen that will allow me to escape cancer. I avoid carcinogens if I avoid the known carcinogens. But that said, I'm eager to find out what the unknown ones are. But that universe is so wide, and I find it kind of fans a particular paranoia about the world, which may or may not prove to be true. So I tell my patients what I do. I tell them exactly what guidelines I follow, but they're very much part and parcel. And I believe in supporting the most rigorous possible trials to find more such questions. I don't disbelieve they exist. I just want to know what they are so that I can avoid them.
What is being done to treat cancer in a positive way, where right now we're doing everything to destroy it by outside means, by chemicals, by radiation, by surgery? What is being done in a positive way to boost our own immune systems by treating or finding stem cells or something to build our immune systems from within?
All of these treatments are in their bare infancy. The one that I talked to Paula about is probably the most mature that I know of in terms of treatments that affect the immune system. Every other thing I think that has been tried before has turned out to have not a very powerful effect, and it's certainly not stayed in proper randomized trials. I'll take a couple of exceptions to that. Two exceptions. One exception is the use of tamoxifen in women who are at very high risk for breast cancer. There have been very clear trials that show that there's a benefit to the use of prophylactic tamoxifen. I hope we can find other ways to do this. And there are significant side effects, so you have to appropriately risk stratify women. The second thing is the use of another hormone therapy for men with prostate cancer. The problem is that when the NCI ran these trials, there was a decrease in prostate cancer, but occasionally the prostate cancers that did emerge from men who'd been treated with this were unfortunately the more aggressive kind. We don't know why. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Each of these treatments comes with a deep cost. So I think risk stratifying up front, followed by appropriate prophylactic strategies, is probably the right thing to do. And you know, primary care internists are very well versed in this. If there's someone, you know, speak up and tell me what you do with your patients. But that's what I do.
Yes.
Hi, Donna Christensen. I have a dear friend whose breast cancer seems to have spread to liver. She'll literally today be getting the results of the biopsy. Are there any treatments, and specifically she's hearing about things like infrared in those, looks sort of like tanning beds,
Yes.
or oxygenation treatments. Is there any promise in either of those or in anything else?
Never tried in large enough. I mean, again, there are case reports of ways in which you can sear cancer cells to death in various sites of the body. The liver has been a particularly tough area because you know, it's hard to reach, and they're cells loaded with enzymes all around it, and therefore can cause all sorts of side effects. But I would say all of that is in its bare infancy.
So would you say no harm to at least try it, or
I
are there
would say that
studies
the best,
going on that?
Well, I would say the best
with infrared, or
I would say the best circumstances is to try. I'm all for trying things. You know, this book is about people trying people trying all sorts of things, patients and doctors trying all sorts of things. I'm all for trying things. I'm only all for trying things though if you can tell me what you're trying and do so in a way that increases my knowledge as well. And by that I mean, I'm not being facetious, I mean enrolling in an appropriately guided trial such that it doesn't become an anecdote, such that every experience contributes to the way I treat cancer and to the way your friend gets treated and to the way, you know, someone else's mother might be treated for breast cancer. So I'm very much in favor of trials, but I want that word to be very important. Trials are done in a particular manner in this country, and we have to think about that when we do so.
Let me just continue on that, if I can, Sid, in terms of trying things, and not in the context of the situation with Donna's friend. And you talk about this in the book as well. You know, trying things at what cost?
Yes.
Because one of the other aspects of the culture of cure you talk about in the United States is that we were very late compared to Europe in developing palliative care, for example, and restoring what you talk about as the sanity and sanctity of the end of life. And then also you talk about, or you ask the question, if Tarceva, for example, can add 12 days to the life of someone with metastatic pancreatic cancer, do you do it, or do you consider the fact that it costs $26,000 for those 12 days?
Well, I'm going to give you two answers to those questions. Number one, let's talk a second about palliative care. I made it a very self-conscious point in the book to write an entire chapter on palliative care, and to actually title one of the 6 sections of the book from a quote from a woman who was first treated with palliative care. I'll tell you the quote because it opens one of the books, one of the chapters. It's called, "Will you throw me out if I don't get better?" That's one of the sections. This is a woman who said to her oncologist in 1960, she said, "I'm not getting better. Will you now stop treating me?" And this is what the world of cancer became so obsessed with succeeding, with victory, with the culture of cure, as you call it, that its obverse, its negative, became failure. And if you did not succeed, then by its very nature, you would become a loser. And if you were a loser, then you were a pariah of oncology. You were cast out to the side. And make no mistake about the fact that palliative care is as much technology as Gleevec. It had to be invented. There was a resistance against it. There was an inventiveness. There was a resilience that needed to be brought out. So just to remind us who one of the key figures were, there were many key figures. One of the key figures in that story was Dame Cecily Saunders from Britain. Not a coincidence, actually, that she was from Europe, where the culture of cure was less obsessed with curing. And Cecily Saunders said to herself, she was a nurse who retrained as a doctor, and she said she was going to physically remove the dying from the oncology wards because they had been cast aside. And she, I quote her in the book, I quote her as saying, you know, taking palliative care is not the antimatter to the matter of cancer care. It's not as if palliative care is against cancer. You know, we're not against the patient, or we're not against the oncologist. This is very much part of knowing what cancer is and treating cancer. And it seems to me that until recently, that entire conversation in this country had sort of collapsed. We had forgotten how to talk about end of life in a sophisticated way. It doesn't have to be just palliative care. Even the word palliative has a kind of a soft, fluffy quality about it which people resist. Caring for the end of life is one of the most fundamental things that we're doing. It is very much part of the healthcare crisis that we're experiencing today. And yet, much like cancer itself, it's a conversation that's oddly disappeared from the public psyche. Someone recently asked me about this book. They said, well, name one thing. They were doing an interview, and they said, well, how would you change? How would you change? Name a public policy direction that you would like to change America. And I said, again, you know, I said very humbly, my only offering would be, let's launch a national conversation on end-of-life care, which really talks about what the benefits are, what the risks are, such that you and I can have a real conversation about it. You know, tell me that you don't want. Tell me that you don't want it. You tell me that you don't want a kind of patronizing approach to end-of-life care, and let's have a conversation about what that means, such that we're not spending a vast part of our healthcare budget on the last 3 months of life. So long answer to your question about the role of palliative care and the directionality of cancer medicine. The second point is, you know, what do we do about the escalating costs of you know, 12 days increase, 25 days increase? It's a slightly more complex answer there. I do think that if you look at this history, there's an iterative process by which science occurs. That 12 days is actually learning that 12 days is important in the history of science, in the history of medicine, because that 12 days changes into 24 days when you add another medicine. It becomes 48 days when you add a third. It becomes 64 when you change another variation. And this is the only way that we've moved forward, by making iterative steps. So I do have a resistance to people who say, well, you know, that trial just showed 12 days increase, because that's the only way we learn. And I think that there has to be something in this history which says that let's record that 12 days, because you know, because that carries meaning.
Question. Yes, Susan, and then Sharon.
Susan Blumenthal, thank you for an extraordinary journey into the past, present, and future of cancer. 2,000 years ago, Hippocrates said prevention is preferable to cure. Yet society spends such a small fraction on prevention. In our country, only 3 to 5% of our $2.6 trillion healthcare budget is spent on prevention. And in part, healthcare reform is trying to take a journey towards preventable disease. When it comes to cancer, you know, you've talked about it being a heterogeneous disease, that there are many ways to cancer. So there's the hope to modify genes that could express cancer, taking medicines like tamoxifen. We've learned, for example, cervical cancer is a virus.
Yes.
So you might be able to take a vaccine to prevent certain types of cancer.
Yes.
And then fairly low-cost behavioral interventions. Around the world, there are different incidences of cancer. So in Japan, there's a high level of stomach cancer.
Yes.
In England and the United States, high levels of breast cancer. That area of gene-environment interaction seems to be a very important one,
Yes.
and yet has not been well explored.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? What can we learn about environmental factors interacting with normal genes and causing them to misspell, like with tobacco, perhaps obesity? And how can we increase investments in this important frontier of 21st century cancer biology?
I think these are absolutely important frontiers. The one thing I'd like to see beginning to happen, and it's happening already, is to bring prevention into the laboratory. And by that I mean there's been a way, these epidemiological studies have been remarkably successful in delineating the role of carcinogens in the world. But even epidemiological studies begin to reach their limit. And the one thing that's sad is that often these epidemiological studies tell us after the carcinogen has already been released. One thing that love to start happening, and it's already happening, is if there is a kind of a collaborative alliance between epidemiologists and laboratory scientists based on our understanding of the cancer cell, such that carcinogens or proto-carcinogens can be tested in the laboratory long before they're released into the public, such that these things can, these elements, these chemicals can be weeded out before they reach the public. I mean, you know, this is happening to some extent with pesticides and so forth. So that's one element that's already coming online, as it were, a kind of a new revamped molecular epidemiology. Now that said, you know, there are viruses to contend with. You mentioned cervical cancer as a major cause. Virus as a major cause for cervical cancer, and I think the sheer diversity of causes really makes us rethink about how we can prevent these. And are there more subtle markers that we should be looking at long before cancer develops? Are there more subtle markers that we can find that will activate prevention research? Just to give you one example of that, of course, the Pap smear itself was invented to find such a subtle marker, right? The idea that you could find a pre-invasive lesion and thereby intervene on cancer was a radical idea in 1960 odd when the Pap smear was developed. So I think you're exactly right that this is the direction that we need to go in. As far as, you know, the 2% of the budget being spent on this, we talked about this already. I think that's an embarrassment.
I have one more question just to follow up, and that is the area of epigenetics. Is, you know, the notion, a new field that there may be when, for example, if you smoke and you develop cancer, that misspelling in the gene could then be passed on to the next generation.
Yes.
Do you think there's something to this?
Absolutely, I think there's something to this. It's a rich field, but we can talk about it offline. But it's a very rich field of epigenetics.
Sorry, Sharon, and then perhaps we have one more question after that.
My name is Sharon McVeigh, and this actually piggybacks on part of your question.
If you could just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
This piggybacks somewhat on your question and your answer regarding subtle markers. I'm part of a minority, but it's growing, of women who have had breast cancer and survived and then have an entirely new occurrence.
Yes.
26 years later, you get a new occurrence, and I guess it addresses the fact that you're living longer. And yet we have no way of knowing, other than BRCA1 and 2, about these subtle markers. And you talk about the lack of funding, and yet we're talking here about preventive care. How can we know what preventive care if we don't recognize the subtle markers? How can we advise our daughters and granddaughters?
That's a very crucial question. You know, someone reminded me, again, it's very important to put matters into perspective. Someone reminded me that if you take the familial breast cancer, just the familial breast cancer, this is breast cancer that's moving, it's known to move in your family, so there's clearly a genetic component there, and you ask the fraction, what is the fraction of BRCA1, BRCA2, and a couple of other genes that explains familial breast cancer? We're not even up to 50%. And what that means is that 75%, let's say, give or take a few percent, 75% of familial breast cancer, where you know that there's a gene clearly involved, is inexplicable by our current genetic testing. So that's just familial breast cancer, by the way. So that means that, of course, a large part of breast cancer is not even familial, and therefore there are many, many more genes. So it is just a reminder of what we're up against in terms of the complexity of breast cancer. Now that said, the investment in the human genome and subsequently the cancer genome projects has already revealed new genes. So if you think of a pie chart, and again we plotted this out recently, if you think of a pie chart, you have a little bit occupied, but now you add the human genome and the cancer genome project, and already you're seeing a little shift. You're beginning to see new genes pop up at a lower frequency than BRCA1 and BRCA2, which begin to explain familial breast cancer. In fact, in more recent news, you'll hear about a couple more such genes that have come out. So bit by bit, step by step, this curve, this pie chart will fill out until we're at least up to 50, maybe 75% for familial breast cancer, and then the next frontier is non-familial variations of breast cancer.
Last question to the gentleman in the front row in the back. And then, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mukherjee will remain to sign books.
And chat.
And chat, thank you. I didn't know if you had another interview after this. He's been on quite the whirlwind.
Dennis, my name is Dennis Turpak. Sorry, 2 questions. How did writing the book influence your own research? I mean, did you have any aha moments as a result of doing the research for the book? And how do you see the war on cancer playing out in a country like India?
Those are very good questions. So I'll take the second question first and the last question. I'll switch the order of the questions around. Well, India is undergoing, men and women in India are just beginning the climb towards longevity as well, which unleashes cancer. So if it's not clear to anyone today, it will become clear very soon that in India too, there has been an unleashing of cancer. And again, we're not talking about cancer in the late old age. I'm talking about cancer in the 60s, 65, 70s, which, as people have started saying in the media, is the new young age, right? So as the population is aging in general, we are meeting, 60s and 65 has become a different, fundamentally different than it was a decade ago, or 2 decades ago, I should say. So in India, at present, the one very clearly emerging factor is lung cancer, and that is because of the incredible penetration of smoking, particularly tobacco companies, in the third world. I mean, just as in the book says, once America stopped being Marlboro country, other countries had to be. And India is one of them. China is another one of them. And the level of machination that has gone on will, even for people who are skeptical about tobacco, I think it's surprising. So the level of machination that's gone into making this movement away from America into the third world, such that there's the master settlement agreement here, and the cigarette companies have now come out as the new wunderkinds of, they've rectified their sins and are now not happening. Go to India, go to China, and you will see that myth debunked in a nanosecond. So evolving fronts in India involve tackling the smoking epidemic, not an easy task, and then tackling major cancers, breast cancer being one of them, in a gradually aging population. Let me give you one very moving thought, which someone just asked me recently. I was on one of the shows, and they said, "Well, tell us about your experiences in India." And I said, the first time I went to visit, I was particularly interested in childhood leukemia in India, because of course that becomes, it's kind of a beacon in this book. And in a country where resources, of course, there's an enormous amount of wealth in India, but in a country where resources are also very, very limited, you have to give a child a 7 or 8 drug toxic chemotherapy over the course of 2 years to cure that child. How does this occur in India? So I went to the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. I was invited to the wards. I went up to the wards to look at these kids. And these kids, there's only 1 or 2 such hospitals. So they're coming from every part of the country. They're essentially, their parents are packing their bags up and coming to live in Delhi with their relatives, with their child who's ill, and putting them in this government-run and government-funded ward. And the child is now being taken care of. And this is, by the way, a curable disease. I was up at the wards, and I was walking down from the wards when just outside in the full sun, I found something very, very interesting. An NGO had taken over this outside, and they pitched a small tent. And inside that tent, these workers, these NGO volunteers, had set up a little classroom, such that the kids, once they had finished their treatment, would come down and they could get a little bit of education along with, because it's a 2-year process, 1.5-year process sometimes. Another person at the other end of that tent was was matching these kids with donors who could possibly fund their chemotherapy. So so there's a matching process so that you don't blindly give money. You actually know that you've saved the life of this one child. And most interestingly, so you go into this hospital. There's this huge hall of kids waiting. This is from kids from every part of the country waiting. And what was amazing is this NGO has sent its fingerlings through the hall, and they pull you out while you're waiting for your doctor. They pull you out and they say, well, why don't you come and chat with us? We'll find a way to match you. And they know the nurses. They've made friends with the nurses so you don't lose your turn. Now, it's hard for me to tell you how moving that experience was for me, because here's a country that's depleted in resources, but the inventiveness, the resilience, the capacity to climb back through back circles and find a way to give these kids therapy. I mean, I came back and I was writing about this. I came back and I said, if we can do that, then we'll walk ourselves out of this epidemic. Was there another question?
The question about your writing the book and whether that's influenced the course of your research.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that it's influenced, I mean, there are 1,000 ways. But in some ways, I think it's influenced the course of my research, not actually, but metaphysically, in the sense that I go to the laboratory and, things like the role of incremental advances, the iterative process of science, the capacity to be proved wrong and then come back and then get the story right again. The capacity to bounce back is something that has influenced me personally very deeply. And the first time my lab mates, lab partners, and also the people who work with me and under me read the book, they echoed that, and it was very gratifying to hear that.
Ladies and gentlemen, if there was any doubt before whether you would enjoy this book, I'm sure it's now been shattered. I'd like to thank Dr. Mukherjee very much, and he will be joining us for conversation.